It's worth noting first that none of the responses to Mark Galli's op-ed in Christianity Today, he was the editor who wrote the op-ed, really address the merits of the case, right? That they don't address whether or not what Trump did in Ukraine is an impeachable offense. Most of the attacks are on two fronts. One is Trump has delivered for us on all of these moral issues, especially abortion, Israel, religious liberty, and the second approach has been to claim that Christianity Today represents educated evangelicals who kind of look down their nose at ordinary, uneducated, working class evangelicals. I would argue that evangelicals for a long time, and I'm not alone in this, have had a long history of anti-intellectualism. Many historians and cultural critics have talked about this so-called scandal of the evangelical mind. So someone like Mark Galli in Christianity Today is trying to put forth a thoughtful, deeply driven by ethics, Christian ethics, to try to say, you know, why are we supporting a man of such gross immorality, to use his term? And the only thing that many of the non-educated evangelicals, those who tend to gravitate to Trump, can offer are what he's done on all of these social and moral issues, which is really, again, how evangelicals have been trained over the past 40 years to think about politics. You know, the Christian right, Jerry Falwell Sr., the moral majority, doesn't get enough attention in our history books. They have done an amazing job at teaching their flock, my flock, I consider myself an evangelical as well, to think about politics in just one way.
John Harwood, as we said in the beginning of this segment, 80% of self-identified white evangelicals support the president. But the question is, can this president, does he have a path to re-election and kind of, you know, pushing away some of the pressures of impeachment and the politics of impeachment if he does not have a solidified evangelical base in his midst?
No, he is absolutely dependent on that. White evangelicals are at the beating heart of President Trump's base. But as the previous discussion has showed us, it's not about the gospel. It's not about religious faith. Trump is not a person of faith. It's not about the moral character of the president. This is a transactional relationship. As Brit Hume, the Fox News commentator, said the other day, it's not complicated for evangelicals. Trump is the enemy of their enemies, and he's willing to fight them. Therefore, they embrace him. Secondly, he appoints pro-life judges, people who are against abortion rights. That is the basis of the relationship, and the added display of culture war here suggests that this is about evangelicals in the cultural dimension, not in the religious dimension. We're talking about a group that is disproportionately in small towns and rural areas, less educated than people who are not evangelical Christians. They're reacting to changes in their communities caused by immigration over time. The share of white Christians in the American population has shrunk from 80% to around 40% over the last 50 years or so. So all of those things are causing those evangelicals to look at Donald Trump as their warrior, and he absolutely needs them to be warriors for him if he's going to win re-election.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.